I wanted a place for people to receive authentic guidance and practical ways to awaken. Thought-provoking, paradigm-shifting, and empowering. This is about expanding our human consciousness to create a wave of new possibilities. I'm Dr. Theresa Bullard-Whyke, and this is Quantum Minds TV. Welcome to Quantum Minds TV, where we take a deep dive into various perspectives on what it's going to take to create a shift in human consciousness. Now, today, I'm very honored to have Gregg Braden joining me. Gregg is a 5-time New York Times bestselling author, scientist, and a pioneer in the emerging paradigm-bridging science, social policy, and human potential. His research resulted in the 2003 discovery of intelligent information encoded into the human genome and the 2010 application of fractal time to predict future occurrences of past events. Gregg's work has led to 15 film credits, 12 award-winning books, now published in over 40 languages, and he was the 2020 nominee for the prestigious Templeton Prize, established to honor outstanding individuals who have devoted their talents to expanding our vision of human purpose and ultimate reality. He has presented his discoveries in over 34 different countries on 6 continents and has been invited to speak to the United Nations, Fortune 500 companies, and the U.S. military. So, Gregg, thank you so much for being my distinguished guest today on Quantum Minds TV. It is a huge honor to have you here.
Oh, Theresa, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm honored to be here. I'm excited. I'm really excited to be here. This is completely unscripted. I have no idea where this is going to go. And I was thinking about this as I was dialing in. This is like a dance, and you're leading the dance, and I'm honored to follow this dance. And my sense is our time is going to go by very quickly today. So,
Yes,
so here we go.
Here we go. Well, thank you for trusting me to I guess, lead the dance this time. When I first became aware of your work, it was in around 2000, and I had read your book, Awakening to Zero Point, and it was really an eye-opener for me. And then after that, I actually attended one of your weekend workshops, a 3-day workshop in Seattle, and I was immediately impressed by a couple of things. You really gained my respect as a scientist, and you gained my admiration as a person, because as a scientist, I really appreciated how much you really did your research, and then how you also really cited your sources that people like me could follow up on that paper trail and go and do our own research and make our own minds about the interpretation of things. But more than that, what stood out to me was just how genuine of a person you are. And every time I've interacted with you, Gregg, you really are so genuine, and you clearly embody everything that you teach. So I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. And I want to dive into all kinds of stuff on human potential and DNA today.
Wow. Well, thank you for that. What you don't know is it's been a tough couple of weeks. It's really good for me to hear that today. So It means probably more than you know. And if you saw me in Seattle, that was a while ago. I think my hair was probably a little longer and darker back then. So thank you. Thank you for that. And I have followed your work as well. So this is the Mutual Admiration Society here. And I love the way that you are bridging so many of the ancient and the mystical traditions with the best science of the modern world, 2 very different languages, but they're both telling us pretty much the same thing, in the sense that we are not what we have been told, number one, and we are more perhaps than we've ever even allowed ourselves to imagine. And I think that is a powerful and a very timely message for our global family and the world that we find ourselves, the world that's at our doorstep today. So yeah. So thank you for that, Theresa.
Yeah, well, you've definitely been one of my role models, and you've really been a pioneer in this field of bridging science and ancient indigenous wisdom, ancient mystical teachings, evidence from ancient civilizations and so forth, and what that tells us all about our human potential, which is a subject near and dear to my heart. So this conversation that you've been having around having a new human story, and it's a shift in paradigm And that is very much about what this is all about. Quantum Minds TV is about what is it going to take to create that shift in human consciousness. And one of the areas that you really have discovered some pretty fascinating research and revelations around is the mysteries of the DNA and how that reveals that we have far more potential inside of us than what we have realized or even been manifesting. And there are ways that we can start to unlock that. So this is something that I want to dive into. And I think in your Awakening 0 Point book, even, which is way back, you talked about these superhuman abilities. You talked about regeneration, self-healing, super immunity, and so many gifts that are there to be unlocked within our DNA. So what would you say are some of the keys to awakening this?
Well, this is a big topic.
Yes.
And so first of all, the book Awakening 0 Point was written in 1986. And we certainly know more now than we knew in 1986. And so there are places in the book where the information needs to be updated. It was based on what was known in 86. And I'm a scientist by degree. I'm a degreed earth scientist, geophysicist, and geologist with a strong multidisciplinary background in the life sciences. So marine biology, as well as math, physics, computer science, and astronomy and archaeology. And I say that because it's that diverse background that has allowed me to stay current with the new discoveries that are seriously coming out on a weekly basis. There's a peer-reviewed scientific journal. It's called Science, and it comes out every month. But there are so many discoveries that are happening. They now supplement, they have been for years now. They supplement that with a weekly newsletter describing the discoveries that have been made in the past week. So all of this has led me to stay current with the discoveries. And I think one of the biggest shifts in thinking for me, Theresa, was the realization that we literally are a highly advanced, technologically sophisticated, soft technology. And that's I'm saying this now because we're going to tie into this throughout this conversation. Yes. Literally a soft technology. And rather than computer chips and artificial intelligence and sensors, the way we typically think of technology, we are cell membranes and neurons and ion potentials moving across cell walls. But we have the unique ability to self-regulate, to upgrade on demand, to upregulate genes on demand. And the key access points to our technology are held in the most ancient and cherished indigenous and spiritual traditions. And it's all about thought, feeling, emotion, breath, and focus. And different combinations of those and how they're used. So when I began to understand that we are a technology, literally a technology, and this was, it's no accident, the timing is no accident. When I was working in the industry in the 1960s, 1970s, early 1980s, computers were just coming into vogue. At that time in the 50s and 60s, they took up a whole room. And, they weren't the microcircuits that we see today in the laptops. And when I began to understand that we are this technology and that we are programmable and upgradable just the way that software was that I was learning at the time, my question was, how far do these parallels extend? How programmable are we? And to what degree can we upgrade or upregulate our own technology? And this led me to look at DNA in a way that was very different than we were thinking of it back in those days. A lot of people just thought that cells were little sacks of water, with some cool stuff floating, including DNA, was just floating around inside the cell nucleus. And now we know, of course, that's not true. And I'm going to say this now, we'll tie into this as well, that the DNA actually is encapsulated in a protein that is called chromatin. And it is the way that the chromatin encapsulates the DNA that determines the quality of how the DNA can express itself in our bodies. So when that chromatin is locked down tight, I mean, you can just kind of visualize this. When it's locked down tight, the DNA is still there, it's still functioning, but it cannot function as efficiently. It cannot express as completely. And when it is looser, and the ability of the DNA to express is called spooling, S-P-O-O-L-I-N-G. So the way the DNA is spooling, or if genes are actually silenced, we have the ability to silence specific genes, is largely related to whether or not this chromatin is wrapped tightly or loosely. And this is the bridge. This is where it gets really interesting, because the chromatin responds to thought, feeling, emotion, breath, and focus.
I've seen some of the research, that shows that when we're, as you're saying, feeling and thinking and expressing more positive emotions, compassion, gratitude, things like that, love, everything within us relaxes. And as does that coiling or that spooling of the DNA. And yet when we are stressed, when we're negative, angry, then everything stresses up, it tenses, it tightens. And so it's almost like as it's wrapping around the histone, then into the chromatin, it's changing the conformation or the structure of the DNA and how much of it's even accessible to be expressed, or which genes can be accessed to build the amino acids and the proteins and so forth. And so I know that HeartMath had done some of this research, but are there other, and there's some epigenetics, of course, some of the work of Bruce Lipton and so forth. So what research have you seen that is indicating these keys of being able to access more of it?
Well, you just covered a lot of ground. So there is an emerging science. Bruce Lipton, our dear friend, spiritual brother, was actually doing the research back in the 1960s that became what we now today called epigenetics. He was taking cells, putting them in a petri dish. Same cells, different environments became expressed differently. They became muscle cell or bone cell or heart tissue or whatever it was. All that changed was the environment. The cell was exactly the same. So that was the foundation for what we now know is epigenetics. Epi is above, so it's above control, above the genetics. What you don't often hear about is we have what is called an epigenome. So most people are familiar with the genome, but the epigenome are the factors, the access points to the DNA. Some of these are very familiar and some are not. I mean, things like certainly diet, exercise, nutrition, supplements, the external environment, temperature, toxins in the environment, those all influence these the ability for the DNA to express. But one of the greatest epigenetic access points is the internal environment. And I'm just going to keep coming back to this. We self-regulate. Sometimes we're aware of it, sometimes we're not. But we self-regulate through thoughts, feelings, emotions, beliefs, the way we think about ourselves, the way we feel about our relationship to the world, breath, and focus. So what this means is we live in a world that's changing faster than we've been conditioned to accept that change. And we've also been conditioned to hinge our sense of well-being, Theresa, on the world around us. And most people don't think about that. We don't wake up in the morning and talk about it at the breakfast table, but if there's relative peace in the world, stock market looks good, retirement, IRA, 401k, kids' education, everybody's healthy, and there's food in the fridge, we're feeling like it's a pretty good day. But when those things start to change, they create this tension in our body. So the unresolved stress, and we know it leads to inflammation. Well, that is the information that we're feeding into the genome and the epigenome. And it makes a lot of sense. When we live in fear, these are all aspects of fear. We're tightening that chromatin, and the DNA isn't able to express as fully. And we see that our immune system, for example, takes a hit. And we all know this. When we live in stress, the immune system takes a hit. So a couple of different things going on here. You mentioned the Institute of HeartMath, a pioneering research organization in Northern California. They're dear friends, colleagues, I've worked with them since their inception. I'm not their employee, but they've allowed me to share their content as an independent author and also give me access to the research. So the research that they did was with DNA outside of the body. Mm-hmm. So it was not in the chromatin when they were researching it. But what they did was they took what's called pristine DNA, and this was from the umbilical cords of newborns. So it had not been damaged through a lifetime of environmental stress, ultraviolet lights, chemicals, toxins, all that pristine DNA. And they isolated it in a device that allowed them to measure, and you mentioned this word, it's called the conformation. It's the shape of the DNA. Mm-hmm. And in the presence of different emotions, here's where it gets interesting. The emotions were generated from another individual, so the DNA wasn't even inside the body. So the emotions of the heart were creating a field or influencing a field that was actually influencing the DNA. And the bottom line, just to make it really easy, what they found was what we would consider negative emotions. So anger, fear, hate, jealousy, rage, tightened that DNA, just like a little knot, and changed that conformation, tightened it up, and it was not able to express fully. And just the opposite was true. Compassion, appreciation, gratitude, all relax the DNA. Now, one of the interesting things, you say, where's the word love? And love means different things to different people. And the word love does not seem to have the same impact. However, love is the umbrella, the general umbrella that encompasses appreciation, gratitude. These are expressions of love, compassion, care. So ultimately, love is, without using the word love, is what allowed the greatest expression of the DNA outside the body. Now, this is a mind blower because this is the.
Can I just ask a question on that for some clarification? Sure. So you're saying that the DNA outside the body was then being influenced by a person who was experimenting with those certain emotions. Would that mean then that not only are we able with our own emotional state to program our DNA, we can also influence another person's DNA conformation if they're within our field based on our emotional state? So
the word, you use the key word, we can influence. We don't control, we don't manipulate, but we definitely have an impact. And we all know this. You know, you walk into a room with people that you love and care about, and you have a conversation, or you have dinner with friends that you have just a really good connection with, and you leave and you're buzzed. You know, you feel good for hours afterwards. You're not sleepy. Your immune system is stronger. They've measured it, to determine this. So yes, we are in constant communication with the world around us as well as the world within us to different degrees. So the HeartMath experiments were the first that were, and this was Roland McCready and Glenn Ryan were the two scientists at this time. And this was done back in the early 90s, 92, 95, right around in there. Published in peer-reviewed journals. So this is real stuff that we're talking about. The idea that a non-physical force, such as human emotion, generated through the heart field, could influence physically the DNA in the human body. That was a novel concept. That was in colloquial terms, that was the mind blower. Yeah. They said how, because now there's another part of this experiment, this series of experiments. And that was that this pristine DNA was isolated and placed into a vacuum tube. And the word vacuum implies that nothing is in there. No air is in there, but we know that photons still exist within that vacuum. And the reason this is important is because photons are the fundamental building blocks of the atom, of physical matter. So what they were doing is, it was an experiment to see if the non-physical stuff that our world is made of, light, photons, could be influenced by the physical stuff that we are made of, DNA. And what they found, they measured the photons in the vacuum by itself, and it was completely random. Photons were all over the place, just what they expected, no surprise there. And when they introduced the DNA into the vacuum, those photons went from being random to becoming ordered. and they align themselves along the axis of the DNA strand. So what we're seeing is the scientific evidence of what our most ancient and cherished spiritual traditions have always said without the science, is that we are part of the world around us, and we have the ability to influence, not control, not impose our will, not manipulate, but we can influence the physical world through non-physical means. So now you put this all together, human emotion is changing the shape of the DNA, and that shape determines the quality of the expression of that DNA in the world, and that DNA influences the photons that are the foundation of the stuff this world is made of. And you take that middle piece out, and what you're saying is emotion is influencing our physical world. And
well, even more than that, potentially. Now, are you referring to the phantom DNA effect from Dr. Peter Garya? Yeah, so even more than just influencing the photons, that when they took the DNA out, and then they took the light through it again, they saw that the light still was structured and ordered, which means that the DNA is informing the quantum vacuum. And there's a communication or something happening there that is structuring that vacuum, that is our DNA is like a portal to be able to connect at quantum level.
Yes. Yeah, well, it's even more than that. I had, for the universal theme in all the indigenous traditions, that I have not visited every indigenous community. Every indigenous community I have visited, they share a common belief that everything is connected, and that we are part of that connection. For a long time, early in my life, I went to school back in 1950s, 60s, and early 70s is when I was in school, and scientists were pushing back on that. Even Einstein's ideas. He didn't like, this is where he struggled toward the end of his life, to unify the forces of nature, the electromagnetic force, gravity, strong and weak nuclear force, to find an eloquent story, an equation that would tie those together, because he was omitting this fundamental force that ties everything together. And I had the privilege of being at the CERN superconducting supercollider in 2017, and there's a lot of controversy around CERN, and we can talk about, a lot of it is unfounded. I will say that a lot of it is unfounded. But in the experiments that were being conducted there, they were recreating the beginning of the universe in the way that they believe the universe began. Some of those ideas are changing now. But the bottom line is, from the first few fractions of a second after our universe began, there is a field of energy, and it was confirmed in CERN in 2012. They announced it on July 4th, 2012, Independence Day in the United States, which is very interesting. Maybe it's a coincidence, I don't know. But the point is that the scientific community is now on board with the fact that to some degree there's a field that's there. Now, I know you've talked with our dear friend and colleague Nassim, and we've had lengthy conversations, and we both believe that what was found at CERN is an expression of a deeper field. But the point is, the scientists are on board with the fact there's a field. But here's where it gets interesting, Theresa. I've gone to the conferences now, and they still do this. These esteemed scientists will stand on the podium, and they'll say, there's a field out there, and their hands do this. I'm out of the frame. There's a field out there that connects all things. They're still separating us from the field. And the reality is that every atom, the average human has about 50 trillion cells in the body. Each of those cells has about 100 trillion atoms. Every one of those atoms is constantly emerging from this field and collapsing back into the field in this eloquent dance. We are the field. And so when we shift our perception, when we shift our thought, feeling, emotion, belief, breath, and focus, it's not like we're trying to influence something over there. We are actually influencing, we are wrinkles in the field. We are disturbances in this field held in place by the consciousness that gives us life. And when that consciousness leaves, we become homogeneous with that field once again. We go back into the fundamental elements. So it's a very different way of thinking, but this is what we're seeing now. It makes sense that we would influence and have influence over the stuff that's happening in that field.
And if I may, so I actually visited CERN in 1998.
Wow.
As a recruiting trip for one of the universities I had applied to for graduate school. And, so I went to go and get a tour of the whole CERN and, the big particle smashing, so it was high energy physics, which was one of the things I was thinking of researching in graduate school. And, what was interesting to me, though, with CERN and some of these other big accelerator experiments is that, they ramp up the energy, and then they smash the particles together at higher and higher energies. And then they watch what comes out of the quantum field, the quantum vacuum, basically. And as they would ramp the energy up more, they would get more particles coming out that they didn't know of before. And, ultimately they're thinking, well, if we can ramp it up high enough, then we would get to the Higgs boson, the God particle that was the one that all of them came from and that created mass and all of this. But my, even in graduate school, for me, it was like, well, it's actually not about the particles. It's more about the energy and what, the field itself that they're trying to tap into. But they're so focused on the particles and on, the physical side of things that there's a paradigm shift that needs to happen even within science for them to understand that the field's not just out there, it is also in here within every atom, every cell of our body, and that we are intimately connected with. And scientists today still, I think, are very much operating on a Newtonian mindset, even though they're steeped in quantum physics. The mindset of how they perceive reality is very Newtonian in that it's deterministic, reductionistic, materialistic, and based on separation. And separation is that key thing where they think that they themselves are separate from their experiments. This sort of closed system idea of how can we can control nature and be separate from it, and my emotions and my thoughts don't influence. But in ancient, the predecessor to science, which was alchemy, the alchemists said, no, our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions, our inner state is intimately connected with whatever we're experimenting on. And I cannot take something outside of me through that transformational process without also transforming myself. And, so the alchemists, the early scientists, used their physical experiments as a reflection for their own inner transformational process. And so here we are coming back around to what we could call a new paradigm, but it's actually an ancient paradigm of all this connectivity, and that we are the universe. We are connected to it all.
Yeah, well, we are, and what you've described is a fundamental difference in the world of physics. Einstein, as brilliant as he was in some respects, was very attached to the idea of separation. And he said, very famously, he said, we live in a world independent. We are independent of the world around us, and that we're lucky if we understand a little bit of it. Mm-hmm. At the same time, he had a colleague. They went to they're both Princeton University, same conferences. They had the same math, the same equations, very different conclusions, John Wheeler. Mm-hmm. And John Wheeler, and he lived much longer. He died in the mid-80s. Einstein, I think, died in 53. So we were blessed to have Wheeler for many more years, pioneering this idea. What Wheeler said very clearly was that the universe is incomplete because we are building the universe. He said the act of observing the world is what he called us living in a participatory universe. Mm-hmm. And so the outcome, and this ties right back into what you were saying about CERN, the implications of what Wheeler said were just so profound, because what he was saying is, here we are as astronomers, we're looking for the edge of the universe. And we're looking, as physicists, we're looking for the smallest particles. So we build bigger and bigger devices to look for the small particles, and we build stronger radio telescopes to look at the edge of the universe. And every once in a while, you'll see an article that says, aha, we found the edge of the universe, or we found the smallest particle. Then they build a new machine that looks deeper, and they say, oh, well, it wasn't the smallest particle, it wasn't the edge. And what Wheeler said, the implication, Theresa, from my understanding of what he said, is that we will probably never find the smallest particle, and we will probably never find the edge of the universe. And the reason for that is where we find our power. The reason is the act of us observing with the expectation that something will be there is an act of creation that will put something there for us to see. And that tells the whole story of our relationship to our bodies and to the world around us, to our most intimate relationships, to our abundance. It is, and it's this shift, this little shift. We are so conditioned to think of ourselves as separate from the world and separate from this field. We are the field. So if we want something, if we want a healing in our bodies, or we want abundance in the world, you've got to give the field something to work with so the field can reflect it back. And we're conditioned to focus on what we don't have, on the illness or the disease or the lack or the hurt. And so the field keeps mirroring that right back, and we think that something is broken. And the work that you're doing so beautifully illustrates what we're saying here through alchemy. You give that field something to work with, but give it what it is that you're dreaming, that you're imagining, in your heart of hearts.
Join us again as we continue to dive deeper into this really fascinating conversation with Gregg Braden on the next episode. And now, stay tuned for a bonus video with Dr. Theresa Bullard as we take a deeper dive into epigenetics.
Now, at one point in time, science thought that who we are and the construct of our bodies and everything was hardwired into our genes. And our genes don't change, unless, it's mutations, random mutations and so forth, which they talk about in evolutionary theory. But the genes, they said at one point in time, science said, we are our genes. We are, in a sense, even slaves to our genes because our genes don't change throughout our lifetime. They are sort of a written code that's just what we get. What you're delivered at birth is what you get, and you can't change it. And so this made us a little bit victims to our genetics. But then came along epigenetics and some of the pioneering work of people like Bruce Lipton, Dawson Church. They brought forward this epigenetic revolution that said there is a layer above the genes, and there's these methyl groups that kind of attach onto the outsides, this layer above the genes. So epigenetic means above the genes, and this chemistry, these methyl groups that come in, they become like on and off switches to the genes. So the epigenetic revolution said, well, actually, we can turn these genes on and off based on environmental factors. But it's not just the environment, like the physical environment around us. It's also the internal environment. So, for example, our stress levels, our cortisol levels, and then our thoughts and our emotions, as we're talking about here. That this is a way that we can create a more positive epigenetic expression that allows us to access more of the genetic potential and or possibly turn off any genes that are disadvantageous, such as if there's a mutated gene or something along those lines. So now epigenetics has given us the power. It's put that ability within our own hands through our lifestyle choices, for example, like what we're consuming, with food and what we drink and these types of things, what kind of lifestyle we have in terms of our stress levels, what kind of environmental pollutants we might be voluntarily exposing ourselves to. These are things that we can control. And then also our inner state of being, whether we're in a more coherent and relaxed and positive state of being, or whether we're in a negative state of being, or depressed, or anxious all the time, or angry, whatever these negative emotions are, they create stress within our system, which then changes the local environment that our genes and our DNA is exposed to, which then affects the epigenetic layers. Now, there's one other more recent study of research that has shown that there is another layer even above that. They haven't given it a name yet, but they have identified that this higher layer that controls the epigenetics, it controls the conformation, or how the DNA is winding itself, how tightly it's wound, that you've been talking about within the chromatin, Greg. And this higher layer of control actually is in the section of the DNA that is non-coding, meaning it's not in our genes. It's in this other part of the DNA that they call the non-coding sections of the DNA, or the introns. Now, in the past, they called this junk DNA. But our DNA is actually 97% this non-coding section in the human genome anyways, and only 3% coding sections, which we would call the genes. And so in the past, they called it junk DNA simply because they didn't know what it did. But now they're starting to discover that there are instruction codes that come from those introns, from that non-coding section, that 97%, that informs downstream to both the epigenetic layers and the genes themselves how to express. And even which gene, because you mentioned one gene that has multiple things that it can produce. These sections of the DNA are telling that gene how to express. So for example, we know that we have the gene within our DNA that is the same gene that salamanders use to regrow a tail. If their tail gets cut off, they can regenerate a new tail. We have that same gene for regeneration in our own DNA. And yet why do we not regenerate a limb if somebody has to have an amputation? Well, because that genetic expression hasn't been turned on through these higher sections of non-coding DNA that inform the epigenetic layers and the genetic layers. So there's some amazing new progress that's going to be made in these coming years, the more that scientists really look into the other 97% of our DNA, which is the non-coding sections, that also controls biophotons. It's the part that controls its connection to the quantum field, and so much more. So I think we can expect some revolutions and insights into more of the multi-layered intricacies of the DNA and how it works. And it's, when you talk about cloning, for example, that's not even considering what's going on within this other 97% of the DNA. So scientists really still are just barely scratching the surface of understanding our DNA.
This conscious conversation was created, produced, and recorded by Dr. Theresa Bullard-Whyke in collaboration with Gregg Braden, and edited by Verse Content and HH Films and Photo. The theme music was created by Tim Mountain of Even Load Productions. Quantum Minds TV is a product of the Quantum Learning Academy.